Hospital, the one place that you know that you are safe. Whether you're seriously ill or just have a routine appointment, hospitals are a place of care and kindness. Many associate them with death and dying, but hospitals are ultimately a place that we'll all end up at least once in our lives. Paramedics, nurses, doctors, ward clerks and the likes are used to dealing with the gruesome and sometimes strange on any given day. After all, hospital is where ambulances are directed, whether the case is urgent or not. The staff working at the General Hospital in Riverside, California got a lot more than they bargained for on February 19th, 1994. At 8:15 in the evening, a 31-year-old woman was rushed into the emergency room. Paramedics dashed her through the sets of double doors, curtains and various corridors before putting her into a curtained-off section of Trauma Room 1. The woman was clinging to consciousness, taking in rapid and shallow breaths. She responded to medical personnel questions with vague and incoherent babbling. Her heart rate was rapidly accelerating and her breathing became shallower and shallower by the minute. Everyone in the ER feared that she wouldn't make it and tried to make her as comfortable as possible. Paramedics noted that her condition had rapidly declined in the time that they had picked her up in the ambulance and dropped her off at the hospital. She told them that she was finding it hard to breathe and felt that her heart felt like it was beating out of her chest. So the paramedics administered some IV fluids and gave her oxygen, and that is when her condition rapidly declined. Welcome to this week's episode of the True Crime Witch podcast. I'm your host Emma, and today I will be covering the case of Gloria Ramirez, the Toxic Lady. Grab a snack, grab a drink, because things are about to get weird. Paramedics rushed the 31-year-old woman to Riverside Hospital, bursting through the doors of A&E and into Trauma Room 1. Staff on duty thought that they were dealing with a heart attack, but the events that transpired over the next few hours would leave even the most experienced doctors scratching their heads. Staff in Trauma Room 1 prepared themselves for another patient who needed their full attention. They prepared a clean bed, grabbed IV fluids, oxygen pumps, and other equipment needed to stabilize Gloria. Sadly, just moments after arriving into Trauma Room 1, she began to slip away. Gloria was quickly transferred to the clean trauma bed, where medical staff began working on her right away. Now, just a quick bit of background about the patient who was rushed into A&E that evening. Her name was Gloria Ramirez, if you can tell by the title. She was 31 years old and she was suffering from terminal cancer, so stage 4 cancer. And she rang an ambulance because she was experiencing very strange symptoms. You know, her heart was felt like it was beating out of her chest. She couldn't breathe. She was slipping in and out of consciousness. So that is when she called the paramedics and they drove her to Riverside Hospital. So as I said, they transferred her to a clean trauma room, put her on a bed, and began working on her right away. She was given different drugs to help sedate her and help, mellow her out. And then as soon as she was administered these drugs, she began rapidly deteriorating. Now, Maureen Welch, who was a respiratory therapist, attended to Gloria, began administering oxygen via an ambu bag. It's a large bag with an oxygen mask attached to it, so oxygen can be pumped directly into her lungs. It's a much more sanitary way than like a conventional mouth-to-mouth, which in recent years, at least in the UK, has been removed from first aid training. After what happened next with Gloria, medical staff would be glad that they didn't perform mouth-to-mouth. When Maureen gave Gloria oxygen, she continued to rapidly deteriorate. All of those attending Trauma Room 1 that evening were puzzled. staff had little time to waste and decided that defibrillation would be the next best move. So they could stop her heart and then be able to restart her heart to get it beating back at a normal rate. It was then when they stripped Gloria off to put the defib pads on her that they noticed that she was covered in a strange, oily sheen, and it was described as like a sickly, garlicky smell, and staff were very, very puzzled as to what this could be. At first they thought she'd used some sort of body moisturiser that would reacting badly to all of the medication and oxygen, but that didn't explain the rancid smell that was emanating from her body. Nurse Susan Kane prepared Gloria's arm to take a blood sample, donning gloves, an apron, and swabbing her arm with an alcohol wipe. Nurse Kane had undoubtedly done this a million times before, but this sample would be the one that would stick in her mind forever. Everyone who works in the medical field has that one case, that one patient that sticks in their mind forever, whether it's a happy story or a sad one. As I said before, I work in a hospital and there are definitely memorable patients, especially when those patients bring you chocolate. It's always very nice. Nurse Kane injected the needle into Gloria's arm and began taking a blood sample. Again, Nurse Kane had likely done this a million times before, but Gloria's sample was different. Nurse Kane noticed a very strong smell coming from the vial. She commented that it smelled like ammonia. The vial was passed around different medical staff to see if they could pinpoint the cause of the smell. That's when one member of staff saw light, manila colour particles floating in Gloria's blood. At this point, 3 people, so Nurse Kane, Julie Gorczynski, who is a medical student, and Maureen Welch, the respiratory therapist, had come into direct contact with Gloria's blood, and one by one, they would all collapse. Now, not only were staff having to deal with a patient in critical condition in Trauma Room 1, but they were now also having to deal with their colleagues too. Mass panic and hysteria quickly broke out. Patients, their loved ones, and even some staff members were at a complete loss as to what was happening. We all expect an emergency room to come with some sort of level of chaos, but we never expect a toxic lady. Gorczynski recalls that she walked over to a nurse's station looking for a seat. She remembers feeling sick and lightheaded. Before she was able to reach the seat, she collapsed and began convulsing. Something in Gloria's blood had caused her to go into a fit. She violently shook and then would stop breathing for seconds at a time, depriving her brain of vital oxygen. Welch recalls that the room began spinning and she heard people screaming around her. Like Gorczynski and Nurse Kane, she too slipped into unconsciousness in a pile on the floor. She remembers waking up at one point, looking at the carnage unfolding in front of her, and that's when she realised that she had no control over any part of her body. She was essentially trapped inside of her own body. At this point, Riverside General Hospital emergency room was a war zone. Hordes of medical staff rushing to Trauma Room 1, whilst others rushed to comfort patients and let them know that they weren't in immediate danger, even if perhaps they could have been at that point. Throughout all of this, the medical staff and other hospital staff on shift remained calm and took great control of the situation. Their level-headedness saved countless lives, even if they were not able to save Gloria's, and they are a real credit not only to Riverside General, but to themselves. Dr. Ochoa, who was the doctor in charge of the emergency room on February 19th, had a decision to make. He had a life-changing decision to make within a split second. Should he evacuate the emergency room, placing vulnerable patients outside in the car park in order to quarantine Trauma Room 1? Or should he allow medical crews to continue their work as normal whilst Trauma Room 1 was isolated? You'll be pleased to know that Dr. Ocher took the first option. Within the blink of an eye, he ordered everyone to evacuate and delegated colleagues to stay behind and help him save Gloria's life. Donned in hazmat suits, Dr. Ochoa and his brave colleagues attempted to resuscitate Gloria and help contain the spread of whatever she had released in her blood. Sadly, at 10 to 9, 31-year-old Gloria Ramirez was pronounced dead. Despite the doctor's best efforts, her blood pressure plummeted and she slowly slipped away. Medical staff continued operating and tending to patients in the car park throughout the night. According to Wonderground, the weather for February 1994 in Riverside, California ranged from anywhere from 75 Fahrenheit to 5 Fahrenheit, so you can imagine that these were less than ideal conditions to be caring for patients. But, as those in the medical field often do, they make the best of what they have. Gloria's death was officially listed as cardiac dysrhythmia caused by acute kidney failure. It's believed that her cancer, as well as interactions from DSMO and other drugs, caused the kidney failure. But I will get further into Gloria's death a little bit later in the episode. This case takes a very strange turn if it isn't already strange. There were 37 members of staff on duty in the emergency room on February 19, 1994, and 23 of those were directly affected by the toxic lady. The majority of those who were affected were women, and the hospital and the investigating bodies chalked this up to mass hysteria. It was much easier for them to say that these women were crazy than to lay any responsibility or culpability back onto the hospital. The mass hysteria claim is something that has always been heavily refuted by those affected. Julie Gorczynski, who was the medical student during the incident, told the Inquirer that there was no way that it was just mass hysteria. She even had medical records to prove it. After the initial exposure, Julie had actually spent 2 weeks in ICU. According to her, she had severe breathing problems, she had contracted hepatitis, avascular necrosis in her legs. Now, avascular necrosis is basically where the bone tissues die due to lack of blood supply, which really doesn't sound pleasant and doesn't seem like something that mass hysteria contributed to. After the initial panic had subsided, hazmat crews arrived on the scene. The Riverside County Hazardous Materials Team, to be exact. Their job was pretty straightforward. Isolate the toxin, clean up the area, everything can resume as normal. The team were unable to identify any traditional toxins such as phosgene or, weaponized chemicals, stuff like that, and this was good news to a certain extent, but it meant that they were dealing with something unknown. And the unknown brought with it unknown consequences, and no plan on how to proceed. When incidents like this occur, there are standard procedures that teams must follow, whether they're medical, hazmat, scientific, forensic, like me, etc. In an incident like this, the job of the first responding crew is to preserve life. That is their main aim, and I wouldn't say little consideration, but obviously preservation of evidence in the crime scene is the last thing on someone's mind when they're trying to save someone's life, is what I'm trying to say. With the hazmat teams being unable to find any chemical weapons or toxins, it was now down to the coroner to decide what had unfolded in Emergency Room 1 on February 19th, 1994. The coroner and their assistants had to approach this autopsy with extreme caution. Because of the worrying symptoms displayed by medical staff and the hazmat team's lack of findings, they were literally going into this blind. They had no idea what was going on. It was their job to find out, but that presents a huge risk. PPE is a given for any autopsy, visors, masks, aprons, gloves, shoe covers, etc. But this autopsy was very different. The coroner and their team were fitted with airtight suits, whilst the room was sealed off with various sterile sheets and airlock cavities. They really, really took Gloria's case seriously, and they were taking no chances. After a grueling 90 minutes, they were finished. They had completed their autopsy. Days passed, and there was still no word from the coroner's office. Everything was eerily quiet. Then, after a few more days, the Riverside Coroner's Office released their findings. Or lack thereof, should I say. Nothing out of the ordinary was found. Gloria had died from liver failure due to complications of her terminal cancer. Everyone in Riverside was stunned. The coroner was the one person that people looked to for answers to the bizarre medical mystery that had unfolded on that cold February night. If the coroner didn't know what the cause of the toxic blood was, then people were pretty sure that no one else would be able to figure it out. But that's where good old forensic science and analytical chemistry come in. Luckily, the Riverside Coroner's Office didn't simply write Gloria's case off as mass hysteria and, a terrible, unfortunate symptom of her terminal cancer. They reached out to the Forensic Science Center at the Lawrence Livermore National Lab in California. FSC agreed to examine Gloria's case and samples of Gloria's blood, bile, and tissues, and they were all sent over to the Livermore lab. Analysts at the lab utilised Headspace and GCMS to analyse the samples. I've used GCMS before, so I'll quickly run through it just in case anyone's curious. So GCMS, or gas chromatography mass spectrometry, is not one but two analytical tools utilised by forensic scientists and other chemists in order to examine samples. Samples are diluted and suspended in solution, placed in vials, and then the GC will inject them into the column. The column then heats up in increments until it reaches a desired temperature. What happens is that different chemicals in the samples run off at different times along the column according to electrical charge and chemical structure. Each chemical has its own specific runoff time. For example, nicotine will always run off at a certain time during analysis, so when you're analysing different samples and consistently see a peak at a certain time, you'll sort of know what you're dealing with. So you can just do GC by itself, but many analytical chemists will couple them together. So then after you've run the GC, you run the sample into the mass spectrometer, which is where electrons are fired at the sample, which causes it to shatter into millions and millions of tiny pieces, allowing for analysis. And when it shatters, each chemical or each component has its own unique shatter pattern, which is how we can identify. I apologise if that was either boring or made no sense at all. It's hard to condense everything down into a 2-minute explanation. But alas, we move on. After a few days and many, many runs and probably much frustration on the analyst's part, the results were in. The analyst in charge found that Gloria's samples contained lidocaine, Tylenol, codeine, and Tegan. Nothing really out of the ordinary for someone suffering with terminal cancer, Most of those are standard pain medications, and obviously lidocaine would have been given to her when she was presented at the hospital, so nothing that they probably wouldn't expect to see. However, other substances were found that were not so easily explained. As I alluded to before, DMSO or dimethyl sulfone was also found in her system. DMSO is an industrial solvent that people can use for cleaning. They clean like ovens and big industrial things with it. And more worryingly, people have started to use it for like a homeopathic pain relief. According to medical professionals, there's no real evidence for its therapeutic use. But then again, when has that ever stopped anyone from doing anything? The theory put forward by Livermore Labs is that Gloria was using DMSO as a last-ditch attempt to kill her pain. Combined with the codeine, lidocaine, and Tylenol in her system, this would have put immense pressure on her kidneys in order to try and regulate everything flowing through her system at once, thus leading to her kidneys failing. But that still didn't explain the toxic blood, or why staff members were passing out left, right and centre, and why they had been afflicted with various conditions in the months afterwards. This is where the magic of chemistry steps in, once again, to save the day. I found a paper titled A Possible Chemical Explanation for the Events Associated with the Death of Gloria Ramirez at Riverside General Hospital by P.M. Grant et al., which was published in the Forensic Science International Journal in 1997. Now, a huge thanks to Kirsty on Twitter for getting full access to this journal for me. Without you, I wouldn't have been able to write this episode. So thank you so much, it really, really helped me out. Now, the journal article is written by P.M. Grant and his peers, but P.M. Grant was the analyst at Livermore Labs who analysed Gloria's samples. Now, the paper is extremely detailed and, I'm not going to be able to cover everything mentioned. Otherwise, this episode is just going to become a literature review instead of a podcast episode. I would highly recommend checking out the paper if you want to do some further reading, and, if you need access to it, drop me an email, drop me a tweet, I will send it over to you, and you'll get a glimpse into what us analytical chemists get up to on a daily basis. Now, Grant et al. Are not claiming to have solved the mystery of the toxic lady, which can be best summarised in a sentence found in section 2, where he writes, "In typical forensic fashion, a best attempt at correlating observations and data with known physical, biological parameters is what is attempted here." Now, the paper works on the assumption that Gloria was in fact using DMSO to ease her pain. DMSO is a colourless, oily liquid at room temperature that is known to give a garlicky smell to it, thus explaining why ER staff tended to Gloria smelt this sweet, garlicky smell when they got close to her and observed the oily sheen on her body, because instead of ingesting it, people will sort of rub it on themselves. When Gloria was given oxygen in the ambulance at the hospital, this caused the DMSO to turn into DSMO-2. It's then thought that when Gloria was defibrillated, that the DMSO2 turned into DMSO4, which is extremely toxic, mutagenic, and carcinogenic. The presence of DMSO4 in Gloria's system, and more importantly in her bloodstream, was what set about in motion the mass panic that would take over Riverside General Emergency Room for the next few hours. Grant et al. Mentioned in their paper that they tested DMSO4 vapours in rats, with horrific results. The maximum time that rats were able to survive DMSO4 vapours without dying was just 2 minutes. Of course, that number would need to be scaled up to accommodate for humans, but either way, DMSO4 is not something that you want to be messing around with. The symptoms reported by staff at the Riverside General Emergency Room match up to the known effects of DMSO4 exposure. DMSO4 exposure symptoms are the following: dizziness, headache, burning eyes, blistering of the skin, convulsions, cerebral edema, delirium, general injury of internal organs, delayed heart damage, delayed kidney damage, delayed liver damage, severe inflammation and necrosis of respiratory tract, and that is just to mention a few. The list does go on and on and on, which if DMSO had turned into DMSO4, that could explain why, the medical staff were experiencing those strange symptoms, and why Gloria had deteriorated so rapidly. Now, this is a great theory, it's backed up by science, it has evidence and results, and if you read the paper you can see all of the chromatograms and all of the stuff, but there's just one issue with this theory. And that's that Gloria's family claimed that she had never used DMSO or anything of the sort to treat her pain. If this was the case, then was this whole scientific investigation fraudulent? Or had this uncovered something that Gloria's family didn't even know that she was doing? Perhaps because of, the shame, or she felt stupid for using an industrial solvent to kill her pain. I'm not sure. Now, this is where Gloria's case turns from somewhat logical and scientific to illogical conspiracy theories. Now, many people believe that the DMSO-4 was not responsible for Gloria's death, and that something much more nefarious was going on in Trauma Room 1 that day. When Gloria's body was returned to her family 2 months after her death, they were unable to commission an independent autopsy as, get this, her heart was missing and her other organs had been contaminated with fecal matter. How and why her organs had been contaminated is a mystery to me, but many believed that this was done on purpose to stop an independent coroner or medical examiner from discovering the truth. Now, there is one last wild theory in Gloria's case, and it's floating around out there, that the Riverside General Hospital was running a meth smuggling ring. More importantly, the theory goes that the staff were using IV bags to smuggle ingredients out used to make meth. They weren't smuggling meth out of the hospital. So, meth does have a few therapeutic uses, and it perhaps would be on site at a hospital, but of course we know it's mainly a drug of abuse. So, on the evening of February 19th, it was postulated that Gloria was given an IV bag full of meth ingredients instead of the standard IV fluids, causing her rapid deterioration. Because the hospital wanted to cover up the incident, they removed her organs and contaminated them to make sure that no one would ever uncover the truth. But then again, that theory still doesn't explain the toxic blood and why Gloria Ramirez was so toxic. Gloria's case is one filled with wild theories and speculation and investigation, but she is now buried in Riverside, California, and as we don't have, organs or anything like that, it may take a lot longer until we know the truth, if we ever know the truth of what happened to Gloria that night at all.